stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the Seeker cards from the Unspeakable Oath, the second Mythos pack in the the Path to Carcosa cycle. I've, as you may have noticed, I've split up the review of the Mythos pack into 5 parts to make it a little easier for you on YouTube to digest. So make sure you check out the reviews for the other classes. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear here, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. With that in mind, let's see what the designers have to offer Arkham Horror Seekers in this Mythos pack. The first card up is a new Seeker asset. This is Charles Ross, Esquire, Acquisitions and Solicitations. He's a 2-cost asset with the ally and patron traits. He has 1 health, 2 sanity, and he takes up the ally slot. He has the game text, "You may spend resources to pay for item assets played by other investigators at your location." And he also has the free trigger, "Exhaust Charles Ross Esquire, reduce the cost of the next item asset played by an investigator at your location by 1. Charles Ross was among the first patrons spoiled by Fantasy Flight Games. However, judging by the decks posted on Arkham DP, he hasn't really inspired players to rush out and build a whole bunch of new decks around him. And it's really not difficult to understand why. Charles Ross is all about generating resource advantage, but the Seeker class already has a superstar who's filling that role in Dr. Mylan Christopher from the core set. Dethroning Dr. Mylan Christopher is going to be a tall order for any card, and I don't think that Charles Ross is powerful enough to do that. I'm not even sure he's powerful enough to unseat some of the other great allies in the Seeker class, such as the art student from the Essex County Express Mythos pack, or Dr. William T. Mallison from Lost in Time and Space, at least in solo play. There are some decks out there where Charles Ross would be right at home. There are many Daisy builds that include anywhere from 5 to 8 cards with the item trait. There are Rex, Min, and Roland builds that also contain a large number of items. I think the biggest problem with Charles Ross, besides the fact that Dr. Mylan Christopher exists, is the fact that you need to exhaust him to use his ability. If your deck includes 4 or 5 unique items, it's going to take you 4 or 5 turns to generate any sort of resource advantage, assuming you play one of those items and one item only during each of those turns. That's a long time to wait for Charles Ross to pay off. It's not even practical if you're trying to set up quickly and you want to play more than one item each turn. If you want to generate a bunch of resources fast, you're probably going to reach for Dr. Mylan Christopher every time. Charles Ross might be able to earn a deck spot if there was a reliable way to ready him so you could trigger him more than once per turn. Unfortunately, there are only 2 ways to do that, and one of them hasn't even been released for the game yet. The first way is to play Ashcan Pete. Ashcan can discard a card to ready an asset he controls. Of course, Charles Ross will be competing with Duke for that discard. He's also competing for a deck slot against one of the most powerful allies in the game in Peter Sylvester. And I really don't like Ross's odds of winning either of those battles. The other option is to wait until the Pallid Mask Mythos pack is released, probably sometime in January, and play Inspiring Presence. This Guardian skill allows you to ready an ally asset at your location if the skill test is successful. Most players, I think, are going to be playing Inspiring Presence to leverage their beat cops, but Roland could use it with Charles Ross. Ross is cheap, and he does come with 2 sanity, which Roland certainly values. But still, that's a lot of hoops to jump through to save yourself 1 or 2 resources every game, and it's just not all that reliable. Charles Ross he's a much more interesting ally to consider in a multiplayer context. More investigators means more items, which means more targets for Charles Ross, especially if you're able to coordinate decks with your fellow players ahead of time. There are some investigators such as William York or just about any Guardian who would be certainly appreciate the extra resources that Charles Ross can provide. Not only can he reduce the cost of those items and help pay for them, he'll also help pay for them, which takes a lot of pressure off that investigator's resource pool. And Guardians are stretched pretty thin for resources sometimes, so I think a Guardian would be very happy to see a player with Charles Ross on the table. Obviously, the earlier you play Charles Ross, the better, because you're going to get the most bang for your buck toward the beginning of the game while investigators are grouped together and they're setting up. Unfortunately, there aren't many ways to guarantee that you'll see Charles Ross early, besides trying to mulligan really hard for him. If you don't see him in your opening hand, your best option is probably to include cards like Cryptic Research, No Stone Unturned, Old Book of Lore, or Preposterous Sketches in your deck to either draw extra cards or tutor him up from your draw deck. If you're playing multiple allies, you could also try playing in Calling in Favors, a neutral event released in this Mythos pack. Calling in Favors allows you to return an ally to your hand to search the top 9 cards of your deck for an ally and play it, reducing its cost by the cost of the ally asset you return to hand. It's a little slow, but it could certainly work in the pinch, especially if you have some of those enters play effects from the ally that you played first. The other thing you need to consider when you're playing Charles Ross is where you're going to get the resources to pay for all these items on behalf of your fellow investigators. Most Seekers, they tend to rely on Dr. Mylan Christopher to generate an abundance of resources. However, unless you're playing Charisma, you're unlikely to have Dr. Mylan Christopher in play at the same time as Charles Ross, so you're going to have to look elsewhere. Emergency Cash is one option. Another option is you could play Charles Ross in a Jenny Barnes deck. Jenny generates that extra resource every turn, which you could use to pay for another investigator's items. You could even consider playing a card like Calling in Favors to swap Charles Ross for a more useful ally like Leo DeLuca in the mid to late game. Another option is to play Charles Ross in a Rex Murphy deck that uses Burglary to generate extra resources. Rex Murphy can use the Burglary to generate 3 resources and grab a clue, so you're not only advancing your win condition, you're also generating resources that you could pay for items that your fellow investigators are playing. And I'm sure they would appreciate the help. I like the idea behind Charles Ross, Esquire. Item is among the most common traits in the game, and there's certainly no shortage of decks that play a fair number of them. Unfortunately for Ross, Seekers already have Dr. Mylan Christopher to generate resource advantage, and barring an errata, it's going to take something really special to knock Dr. Mylan Christopher off his perch, and I just don't think Ross is that card. That could change if we do receive a reliable way to ready an asset, so keep your eyes out for a card like that in future Mythos packs. I think Ross has a more rosy future in multiplayer. I've seen at least one report of Ross pulling his weight when teamed with a resource-starved investigator, so he certainly has potential. The trick is getting him into play quickly and generating enough resources to take advantage of his ability. If you can find a way to ready in 2, you could have a very potent way to generate resource advantage for your team of investigators. The second Seeker card in the pack is Forewarned. It's a free event that costs 1 experience point. It has a willpower icon and the insight trait. It has the game text Fast. Play when you draw a non-weakness treachery card. Place one of your clues on your location, then cancel that card's revelation effect. The ability to manipulate the card you draw from the encounter deck during the Mythos phase is one of the most powerful in the game. So Forewarned is one of those cards that should immediately pop up on your radar when you're building around an investigator who can play Seeker cards. When the core set was released, Mystic was the only class that could cancel the revelation effect of a treachery card. The Lost in Time and Space Mythos pack expanded Investigator's options. Mystics received Ward of Protection level 5, which could cancel any encounter card, not just treacheries, while Seekers received Dr. William T. Malison. Malison could cancel the drawing of an encounter card, shuffle it back into the encounter deck, then draw a new card, as long as you were willing to drop a clue at your location. Like Malison, Forewarned forces you to drop a clue at your location if you want to play it. You can target only treacheries, but Forewarned will cancel them outright, rather than reshuffle them back into your deck, which makes it slightly less flexible and more powerful than Malison at the same time. The biggest problem with Malison is that he's an ally in a class with a lot of great allies. Some investigators aren't really interested in playing him, and that's okay, because now they can take Forewarned if they want that sort of ability. Daisy can play either Ward of Protection or Forewarned, and I think most players will prefer to save the experience and opt for Ward of Protection, although it can be a liability in scenarios like Curtain Call, which punishes you if you take too much horror. Alternatively, you could just take both and make some sort of encounter deck denial, or an encounter deck denial deck that basically just tries to stop the encounter deck in its tracks and not let any treachery fire. Rex can take either Ward of Protection or Forewarned. Ward of Protection counts against his limit of 5 level 0 cards from any other class, so I think most players are going to wait until Rex has gained some experience to pick up Forewarned, depending on the type of build they're going for. Min can pick up either Forewarned or a Test of Will. Considering that a Test of Will requires you to exile it, remove it from the game entirely, as well as your deck, I think Forewarned is clearly a better choice for everyone's favorite secretary. Forewarned also happens to be Roland's only option if he wants to cancel a treachery card outright. However, that may change later in this cycle if the Guardians do receive a card that can cancel treacheries, although, you know, it might Let Me Handle This, which was released in the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion, might be their cards, so we'll just have to wait and see whether they get a treachery cancel card of their own. The ability to cancel a treachery card is really a key moment that can be the difference between victory and defeat in a scenario. Ward of Protection has saved my ass in the past more times than I can count, and I expect Forewarned will do the same if I'm playing an investigator who can play Seeker cards. Dropping a clue at a location is a little annoying, but you know, it's a small price to pay if the treachery is going to wreck your game. And most Seekers really shouldn't have that much trouble picking up that clue on a later action. Forewarned likely isn't the first card you're going to buy with your experience, but you're certainly going to want to take a closer look at it toward the middle and the end of the campaign, when scenarios become a lot more challenging. That's going to do it for my look at the Seeker cards in the Unspeakable Oath Mythos pack. Seekers they've received a lot of great cards over the past 2 cycles, and naturally this is going to make it difficult for each subsequent card that is released to really make an impression on players. And I think Charles Ross is a victim of that to some extent. While he's certainly capable of generating resource advantage, it's a little slower and more restrictive than his counterpart, Dr. Mylan Christopher. And you know, competition for the ally slot is just so fierce in every Arkham horror deck, and I just don't think that Charles Ross makes the cut, at least in solo play. He has potential in multiplayer, but he's the type of card you need to build around, and not just you. Your fellow investigators also need to take him into consideration if you really want to leverage his ability. I think if the designers release a card that makes it easier to fetch allies or ready them during your turn, Ross's stock could certainly go up as the game progresses. Forewarned, on the other hand, it's just extremely useful, and it's going to find a home in many different decks. Daisy has always had the option of canceling treachery cards with a word of protection, and now the other Seekers, as well as Roland Banks, have that option too. Dropping a clue isn't ideal, but any Seeker worth his or her salt shouldn't have too much trouble recovering from that. In the case of Roland, dropping a clue can also be helpful, if he needs to clear his weakness cover-up and there are no clues on the table. And really, besides, what good are clues if the treachery you're facing happens to end the game? So it's a good card. That's going to do it for my review of the Seeker cards in the Unspeakable Oath. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Do you agree or disagree with what I've said about the cards? By all means, leave a comment down below and share your stories. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you'd like to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.